tell us after releasing these never-before-seen videos and information, they're deeming this case closed.
You will see this person dump the bag into an area.
Footage and pictures revolving around the kidnapping and killing of 6-year-old Faye Swetlik.
On a quiet February afternoon, Faye ran outside to play like she had done so many times before, never knowing that within minutes she would vanish into a silence that would shake an entire community. Nothing about that day felt different at first. The air was calm, the neighborhood familiar, and everything seemed exactly as it always had. But somewhere between ordinary moments and the fading light of day, something unthinkable was already unfolding, hidden in plain sight. Faye Marie Swetlik was just 6 years old. She lived in the small city of Kaise, a quiet place where neighbors recognized each other, where kids played outside without fear, and where life moved at a steady, predictable pace. It wasn't the kind of place where parents constantly looked over their shoulders. It was the kind of place where trust still existed. Faye was the kind of child people noticed instantly, not because she tried to stand out, but because she simply did. She had this natural brightness to her, a kind of energy that filled a room without effort. According to her family, she loved giving compliments to strangers, something that might seem small, but for her it was almost instinctive. If she liked your shoes, she'd tell you. If your hair looked nice, she'd say it out loud. There was no hesitation, no filter, just pure, genuine kindness. Her mother, Selina Swetlik, often described her as her little magical fairy. It wasn't just a nickname, it was how she saw her. Faye had this way of moving through the world that felt light, almost effortless, like she carried joy with her wherever she went. She laughed easily, played endlessly, and found excitement in things most people would overlook. She loved being outside. That was one of the most consistent parts of her routine. After school, after a quick snack, she would head straight into the yard. It wasn't a large space, but to Faye, it didn't need to be. It was enough. She would run, explore, invent games, and lose herself in her own little world. Neighbors would often see her out there, moving back and forth, sometimes talking to herself, sometimes laughing at something only she understood. And in a neighborhood like Churchill Heights, that wasn't unusual. Children played, parents checked in, life went on. Faye was also deeply social in a way that felt almost rare. She didn't just want to be around people, she wanted to connect with them. She would strike up conversations with strangers, try to make new friends wherever she went, and always seemed to believe the best in everyone. It was a kind of openness that made her incredibly lovable, but also, in ways no one realized at the time, incredibly vulnerable. At school, she carried that same energy with her. Teachers and classmates remembered her as enthusiastic and warm, someone who didn't just participate but fully engaged. She wasn't quiet or withdrawn, she was present. Whether it was talking, playing, or simply being part of the group, Faye made sure she was included, and that others were too. She liked colorful things. Pink and purple were her favorites. Bright colors, soft textures, anything that felt playful or expressive. She enjoyed small, simple joys, drawing, writing little notes, dancing without caring who was watching. Her world wasn't complicated, it didn't need to be. At home, her relationship with her mother was close, protective, but not restrictive. Selina checked on her frequently when she played outside, stepping out every few minutes just to make sure everything was okay. It was a routine built on instinct, not fear. Because fear didn't feel necessary. Not theirs, not in that neighborhood, not in that moment. On February 10, 2020, the day started like any other. Faye went to school at Springdale Elementary. Nothing unusual was reported, no signs that anything was wrong. She was just another child going through another normal day, learning, talking, existing in a world that still felt safe. That afternoon, just before 3:00 p.m., she got off the school bus. Her mother was there waiting like always. They walked home together, talking casually the way they always did. There was no urgency, no tension, just a quiet routine repeated hundreds of times before. When they got home, Faye had a snack, something quick, something ordinary, and then, like she always did, she asked to go outside. And she was allowed to, because nothing about that moment felt dangerous. She stepped out into the yard. Neighbors later reported seeing her playing near the fence line, moving around the area she was familiar with. It was sometime between 3:30 and 4:00 p.m. Everything still looked normal. There were no screams, no visible signs of distress, nothing that would have immediately raised alarm. Inside the house, Selina continued her routine, checking every few minutes, looking out the window, making sure Faye was still there. And for a while she was. Until suddenly she was. At around 3:45 p.m., Selina stepped outside again. This time something felt different. The yard was empty. At first, it didn't immediately register as something serious. Maybe Faye had gone to a neighbor's house. Maybe she was just out of sight for a moment. It had happened before, small, harmless variations of the same routine. But as seconds turned into minutes, that feeling began to change. Selena started calling her name. No response. She checked nearby areas, walked to neighbors, asked if anyone had seen her. Nothing. The normal explanations started to fall apart one by one. And in their place, something else began to grow, something heavier, harder to ignore. By 5:00 p.m., she called 911. Her voice, according to released audio, carried a mix of confusion and rising panic. She tried to explain the situation, tried to stay composed, but underneath it, the fear was already there. "I can't find my daughter." Those words changed everything. Within minutes, police arrived. What had started as a missing child report quickly escalated into something much larger. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, going door to door, asking questions, searching for any sign of where Faye might have gone. Time started to matter in a different way now. Every minute felt critical. By early evening, more responders had arrived. The search expanded. Flashlights, patrol units, neighbors watching from their windows, it all began to shift the atmosphere of the neighborhood. What had once felt safe now felt uncertain. By 6:00 p.m., the Federal Bureau of Investigation had joined the search. That alone signaled something serious. Helicopters were brought in. K-9 units began tracking scent trails. Officers worked methodically, covering ground as efficiently as possible. The goal was simple: find Faye. But as the hours passed, something became clear. There were no obvious signs of where she had gone. No clear direction. No immediate answers. And that uncertainty, that lack of anything concrete, began to weigh heavily on everyone involved. Because in cases like this, time doesn't just pass. It works against you. As night fell over Case, the search didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. But somewhere just beyond what anyone could see, something had already happened. And by the time the sun would rise again, this would no longer be a search for a missing child. It would become something much darker. In the same quiet neighborhood where Faye laughed, played, and trusted the world around her, someone else was living a very different kind of life, one that, on the surface, barely registered to anyone at all. Cody Scott Taylor was 30 years old. He lived just blocks away from where Faye disappeared, in the same Churchill Heights community in Case. To most people around him, he wasn't someone who stood out. He wasn't loud, he wasn't disruptive, and he didn't draw attention. If anything, he was the opposite: quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible. And in many ways, that made him easy to overlook. There are no widely reported records of a violent criminal history tied to Taylor before this case. No known pattern of escalating offenses, no documented incidents that would have clearly marked him as dangerous. On paper, his life appeared relatively ordinary, at least at a distance. But distance can be deceiving. People who knew him described him as socially isolated. He didn't form close connections easily. Conversations with him were often short, sometimes awkward, and rarely went beyond surface-level interactions. He kept to himself, even in shared living spaces. Taylor lived with roommates, people he also worked with at a local restaurant. That kind of setup usually creates some level of familiarity, even friendship. But according to their statements, he never fully engaged. He was present, but not connected. There was a kind of emotional distance in the way he interacted with others. And over time, that distance seemed to grow. Some acquaintances later told investigators that Taylor spoke negatively about himself. He reportedly expressed feelings of isolation, sometimes describing himself as someone who didn't fit into normal social structures. There were also reports that he identified with online communities associated with loneliness and social rejection, though the extent of that involvement remains unclear. What is known is that he struggled internally. There were mentions, according to reports, of depressive thoughts, even references to suicidal ideation at times. But like many people dealing with those thoughts, he didn't openly seek help in a consistent or visible way. Instead, much of what he felt seemed to remain internal, hidden beneath a surface that appeared quiet but stable. He had studied mathematics at the University of South Carolina, though there are no confirmed records indicating that he completed a degree. That part of his life, like many others, seemed unfinished without a clear direction or resolution. His employment history was inconsistent. He moved between jobs, never settling into anything long-term. At the time of the incident, he was working at a Wingstop restaurant. It was a routine job, nothing particularly remarkable. But those who worked with him noticed something familiar. He kept to himself, avoided unnecessary interaction, and rarely revealed anything personal. From the outside, his life looked quiet. But quiet doesn't always mean stable. In the days leading up to Faye's disappearance, nothing about Taylor's behavior triggered immediate alarm among those around him. He went to work. He returned home. He followed his routine. There were no obvious signs, at least none that stood out in a way that would have prompted concern. And that's part of what made everything that followed so difficult to process. Because when something like this happens, people instinctively look backward, searching for clues that were missed. Moments that seemed insignificant at the time suddenly feel important. Conversations take on new meaning. Small details become part of a larger picture. But in Taylor's case, that picture remained incomplete. There was no clear, documented connection between him and Faye before February 10, 2020. They were neighbors, but not in a way that implied familiarity. There's no confirmed evidence that they had ever spoken, interacted, or even acknowledged each other directly. Their lives existed in the same physical space, but on completely separate paths. Until suddenly they didn't. Investigators later believed that Taylor had been watching. Not necessarily in a prolonged, calculated way, but enough to recognize patterns. Enough to understand that children played outside in that neighborhood, that routines existed, that moments of opportunity appeared. Faye's openness, her natural trust in people, may have made her more approachable than others. But this part of the case remains one of its most unsettling uncertainties. There is no confirmed account of how Taylor approached her. No clear evidence showing whether he used force immediately or attempted to gain her trust first. That gap, those missing moments, are among the most difficult parts of the case to fully understand. What is known is what happened after. Because in the hours following Faye's disappearance, Taylor's behavior began to shift, subtly at first, but enough to stand out later when investigators pieced together the timeline. On the evening of February 11, police conducted a search of his apartment. At that point, Taylor wasn't considered a primary suspect. He was simply one of many individuals in the area being checked as part of a broad investigation. Officers spoke with his roommate, who allowed them inside. The search didn't immediately reveal anything alarming. There were no visible signs of a struggle, no obvious evidence of a crime, just a normal apartment cluttered in the way shared living spaces often are. But there were small details. A bag of laundry. An unusual smell, though at the time it wasn't clearly identified or connected to anything specific. And on a table, a flyer. A missing person flyer for Faye. At that moment, it didn't seem unusual. The entire neighborhood was aware of the search. Flyers were being distributed widely. Seeing one inside an apartment didn't stand out. But later it would. Because context changes everything. When Taylor returned home that night, his roommate noticed something different. He seemed tense. Not in a way that could be easily explained, but enough to feel off. His movements, his tone, the way he carried himself, it wasn't consistent with how he usually behaved. Still nothing concrete. Nothing that could be acted on immediately. The next day, February 12, investigators returned. This time they spoke directly with Taylor. When asked about his whereabouts during the time Faye went missing, his answer was simple. He said he had been home, asleep. It was a vague response, one that couldn't be easily verified. But again, without physical evidence tying him to the disappearance, there wasn't enough to escalate further at that moment. So the investigation continued, expanding outward, following leads, collecting footage, interviewing witnesses. And somewhere within that growing body of information, a pattern was beginning to form, one that hadn't yet fully surfaced but was slowly moving into focus. Because while officers were searching neighborhoods, reviewing surveillance, and asking questions, Cody Scott Taylor was already taking steps that would later define the entire case. In the early hours of February 13, sometime around 1:00 a.m., a surveillance camera captured a figure moving through a wooded area near the neighborhood. It was dark. The figure held a light, shining it on the ground, moving slowly, deliberately. At the time, no one knew who it was. But later, investigators would confirm it was Taylor. And that footage would become one of the most critical pieces of the timeline. Because it showed something important. Not just presence, but intent. Movement through a specific area. A pattern of behavior that didn't align with anything normal. And just a few hours later, that same pattern would continue, this time in broad daylight. By morning, Taylor would be seen again. Walking calmly. Entering a store. Making purchases that, on their own, might not have meant anything. But together, in sequence, would begin to tell a story no one in Case was prepared to hear. A story that was already far more complete than anyone realized. And by the time investigators fully understood what they were looking at, it would already be too late to stop what had happened. By the time the sun began to set on February 10, 2020, Faye was already gone. What had started as a normal afternoon, school, a walk home, a quick snack, and time outside had quietly turned into something far more serious. But in those first moments, no one knew exactly when the shift had happened. There were no witnesses who saw everything, no single moment that clearly marked the transition from safety to danger. Only a gap, a window of time where Faye simply disappeared. Investigators would later work backward, trying to reconstruct those missing minutes with as much accuracy as possible. Based on witness statements and known timelines, Faye was last seen playing outside between approximately 3:30 and 3:45 p.m. in her yard in Case. She was wearing what would become one of the most recognizable details of the case, a black t-shirt with the word peace across the front, a skirt, and her polka-dot rain boots. Then within minutes she was gone. There were no confirmed signs of a struggle in the yard, no loud noises reported. No immediate indication that something violent had occurred in that space. That absence of disturbance would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because it suggested something specific. Either it happened quickly or it happened quietly. Or both. Investigators believe that Cody Scott Taylor took Faye from that yard sometime during that narrow window. The exact method, whether he used force immediately or attempted to gain her trust, has never been fully confirmed. But what is clear is what happened after she was taken. According to official findings, Faye was killed just hours later. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. That detail alone carries weight not just because of what it means physically, but because of what it suggests about proximity. This was not something distant or detached, it required direct contact. It happened close, personal. And it happened quickly. Investigators believe that after the abduction, Taylor brought Faye to his apartment, located within the same neighborhood. That proximity is difficult to ignore. The distance between where she was last seen and where she was taken was minimal. Almost within sight. Inside that apartment, according to the investigation, Faye's life ended. What followed was not immediate discovery, but concealment. For approximately 2 days, her body remained hidden. That period is one of the most disturbing aspects of the timeline, not because of what is fully known, but because of what almost wasn't discovered at all. During that time, law enforcement searched Taylor's apartment. Twice. On February 11, officers entered the residence as part of routine neighborhood canvassing. They spoke with his roommate, conducted a visual inspection, and collected some items for analysis, including a bag of laundry that belonged to Taylor. At that point, there was no direct evidence linking him to Faye. Nothing visible. Nothing conclusive. They left. And then, on February 12, they returned again, this time speaking directly with Taylor. He stated that he had been home during the time Faye went missing. His explanation was vague, but without physical evidence contradicting it, investigators could not yet move further. And all the while, the truth remained hidden just beyond what they could see. It wasn't until the early hours of February 13 that the timeline began to shift. At approximately 1:00 a.m., a surveillance camera captured a figure moving through a wooded area near the neighborhood. The person held a light scanning the ground, moving slowly and deliberately through the darkness. At the time, it was just a strange detail. But later, investigators confirmed it was Taylor. That footage would become critical, because it showed not just presence but behavior, purposeful movement, and it wasn't the only time he was captured that morning. Roughly 6 hours later, just before 7:00 a.m., Taylor was seen again, this time walking toward a Walmart on Augusta Road. The city was just beginning to wake up. Traffic was light, everything appeared ordinary. He entered the store, and for about 20 minutes, he stayed in the gardening section. Surveillance footage shows him moving slowly, pausing, looking at items without clear direction. Employees later reported that he seemed unsure, asking questions that didn't quite align with someone who had experience with gardening. Eventually, he made a purchase. Bags of soil, fertilizer, seed packets, and a box of Pop-Tarts. On their own, those items meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. After leaving the store, Taylor requested a ride through a rideshare service. The driver later told investigators that something about him felt off, distant, tense, not fully engaged in conversation. At one point, the driver mentioned the ongoing search for Faye. Taylor reportedly responded that he didn't know her, that he had never seen her before. But by then, the truth was already unfolding. At approximately 7:47 a.m., surveillance cameras once again captured movement in the same wooded area from earlier that morning. This time the image was clearer. Taylor was carrying one of the bags he had just purchased. He walked directly into the trees, toward a specific area. He remained there for about a minute. Then he came back out, without the bag. That moment, brief as it was, would later define the turning point of the investigation, because it suggested something final, something deliberate, and something hidden. Later that same morning, investigators made a critical decision. It was trash collection day, and they knew that if any evidence had been discarded, it could be lost permanently once those bins were emptied. So they moved quickly. Officers began searching trash containers throughout the neighborhood, systematically, carefully, checking every possible location. And then near Taylor's residence, they found something. A child's rain boot, polka-dotted, and a kitchen ladle covered in dirt. Those items didn't belong there. They didn't fit. And immediately they changed everything. Within minutes of that discovery, the search shifted. Officers returned to the wooded area seen in the surveillance footage. This time with a focus, a direction. Less than 30 minutes later, Public Safety Director Byron Snellgrove located a shallow grave. It was less than 200 feet from Faye's home. Dangerously close. And inside, they found her. Faye Marie Swetlik had been buried there, hidden beneath the ground in a place that, just days earlier, had been part of the same environment she played in. Next to her body was her second boot. The scene confirmed what no one had wanted to believe. This was no longer a search. It was a homicide investigation. And just minutes after that discovery, another call came in. From the same neighborhood. In the backyard of his residence, Cody Scott Taylor was found dead. He had taken his own life. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no explanation, only evidence. DNA collected from under Faye's fingernails matched Taylor. Additional forensic analysis connected both of them to items recovered from the trash. Every piece aligned. Every detail pointed in the same direction. Investigators concluded that he had acted alone. But the most difficult part remained unanswered. Why? There was no note, no confession, no clear motive. Just a sequence of actions that ended in tragedy and a silence that would never fully be filled. And as the community began to process what had happened, one truth became impossible to ignore. The danger had never been far away. It had been right there. All along, by the morning of February 13, 2020, the search for Faye Marie Swetlik had already transformed into something far more devastating. What began as a desperate effort to bring a missing child home safely had ended in the worst possible outcome. But even as grief began to spread through Case, investigators still had a responsibility to understand exactly what had happened, to document every detail, and to ensure that every piece of evidence told a consistent and undeniable story. Because even though the person responsible, Cody Scott Taylor, was already dead, the case itself was far from over. It had to be proven, methodically, completely, without doubt. The investigation tightens. Once Faye's body was discovered in the wooded area near her home, the focus of the investigation narrowed instantly. What had once been a wide search across neighborhoods and possible leads now concentrated on a specific sequence of events and a single individual. Forensic teams moved quickly. The burial site was carefully documented. Soil samples were collected. Every item found near Faye's body was preserved, cataloged, and analyzed. Investigators treated the scene with the same level of precision they would have used if a suspect were still alive and awaiting trial. Because in many ways, they were building a case anyway. A case for the truth. DNA evidence became one of the most critical components. According to official reports, DNA recovered from under Faye's fingernails matched Cody Scott Taylor. That detail carried significant weight. It indicated physical contact, direct interaction, at some point before her death. Additional forensic analysis connected both Faye and Taylor to items found in the trash near his residence. The polka dot rain boot, the kitchen ladle, and materials recovered from a black laundry bag all contained DNA evidence linking them together. Individually, each piece mattered. Together, they formed a complete picture. Reconstructing the timeline. Investigators began reconstructing Taylor's movements in the hours and days following Faye's disappearance. Surveillance footage played a central role. The video captured at approximately 1:00 a.m. on February 13 showed Taylor moving through the wooded area with a light, an action that, in hindsight, appeared to be preparation. Then came the footage from later that morning. His trip to Walmart. His time in the gardening section. The purchase of soil and fertilizer. The return to the wooded area at 7:47 a.m. Each moment aligned with the physical evidence found later. Each action added another layer to the timeline. And perhaps most importantly, each step demonstrated intent, not impulsive behavior, but a sequence of deliberate decisions. The final act. By the time investigators reached Taylor's residence on February 13, they were no longer just following leads. They were closing in on certainty. But they would never have the opportunity to confront him. Because shortly after Faye's body was discovered, Taylor stepped onto the back porch of his home and took his own life. There was no arrest, no interrogation, no courtroom, only silence. That moment, his death, changed the trajectory of the case completely. Because in the absence of a living suspect, the investigation had to answer questions without the one person who could have provided direct explanations. There would be no confession. No statement of motive. No final account of what happened in those missing minutes. And that absence left a gap, one that evidence could fill in part but never entirely. Was there anyone else? One of the first questions investigators had to address was whether Taylor acted alone. In cases like this, it's critical to rule out the involvement of others, to ensure that no additional threats remain and that the full scope of the crime is understood. According to official statements from law enforcement, there was no evidence suggesting that anyone else was involved. No accomplices. No coordinated effort. All available evidence pointed to a single conclusion: Taylor acted alone. That determination was based on forensic findings, surveillance footage, witness statements, and the absence of any contradictory evidence. But even with that clarity, the emotional weight of the case remained. Because knowing who did it does not always explain why. The question of motive. Despite the extensive investigation, one critical question was never definitively answered. Why? Why Faye? Why that day? Why that moment? Investigators examined Taylor's background, his digital history, his personal relationships, searching for any indication of a motive. But nothing conclusive emerged. There was no evidence of a prior relationship between him and Faye. No clear indication of premeditated targeting. No documented reasoning that could explain his actions in a way that made sense. Some reports suggested that he struggled with isolation and mental health challenges. But those details, while important, do not provide a direct answer. And law enforcement was careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence supported. Because in a case like this, assumptions can distort truth. And truth was all they had left to offer. Legal closure without a trial. In most homicide cases, justice is delivered through the legal system, through arrest, trial, verdict, and sentencing. But this case was different. With Taylor's death, there would be no trial, no jury, no sentencing. Instead, the case moved toward administrative closure. Investigators compiled their findings, documented every piece of evidence, and presented a final report outlining their conclusions. That report stated clearly, Cody Scott Taylor abducted and murdered Faye Marie Swetlik and acted alone. It was as close to legal certainty as the situation allowed. But for many, it didn't feel like justice. Because justice, in its most traditional sense, involves accountability. And accountability requires a living person to answer for their actions. That never happened. The family in the aftermath. For Faye's family, the outcome brought a painful mixture of answers and unanswered questions. They knew who was responsible. They knew what had happened. But they would never know why. There would be no moment in a courtroom where they could face the person who took her life. No opportunity to hear an explanation. No chance to ask questions. And that absence, like so many others in this case, became part of the grief. A community changed forever. The impact on case extended far beyond the investigation itself. This was a community that had once felt safe, predictable, familiar. But after February 2020, that sense of security was shaken. Parents became more cautious, neighbors more aware. The idea that something like this could happen so close to home changed how people viewed their surroundings. Because the threat hadn't come from far away. It had come from within. From someone who lived among them. Someone they might have passed without noticing. And that realization lingered. The case closes, but not completely. It took nearly a year for the investigation to be formally closed. During that time, agencies continued to review evidence, confirm findings, and ensure that no detail had been overlooked. Even after the official conclusion, certain aspects remained open, reviewed by federal and state agencies in case new information ever surfaced. Because in cases like this, closure is rarely absolute. There is always a part of it that remains unfinished. Not in the evidence, but in the understanding. And as the investigation came to an end, one truth remained at the center of it all. A 6-year-old girl had lost her life. A family had lost their child. And a